So Dr. Fiona Noble is a lecturer in Spanish and Latin American Studies at the University of Stirling in Scotland. She is the author of Subversive Spanish Cinema, The Politics of Performance by Bloomsbury in 2020, and has also published on migration, childhood, and intercultural lesbian relationships in contemporary Spanish cinema. Her current research encompasses two key strands. One, a monograph on the work of Spanish socio-realist filmmaker Fernando León de Aranoa, under contract with Manchester University Press. And two, the investigation of gender and voice in contemporary Spanish cinema and television/streaming. Forthcoming publications include an article and a book chapter analyzing gender and voice in the series such as La Casa de Papel, which in English is Money Heist, one of my favorites, I have to say, and also Vis-a-Vis, Locked Up, which ran from 2015 to 2019. So I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Fiona Noble, and she will be presenting today her paper entitled Scratching Old Wounds, Blood, Skin, and Touch in Estiu 1993, directed by Carla Simón. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that introduction, and also for inviting me to participate in what I think is a really innovative initiative. And, you know, I applaud you for that. I think it's really great, a really great idea, and it's a delight. And you were just chatting before about how, although the pandemic and COVID brought a lot of negatives into our lives, I think it's great that we've been able to make connections and events happen like these. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I am going to talk to you today about Estiu, as Christina said, and I'm just going to make sure I've got my slides in front of me here. Here we go. So before we start, I do just want to give a brief trigger warning for the presentation today. Hopefully you've all managed to see the film, and you will know that it's a beautiful film in many ways, but it's also extremely moving, deals with really difficult issues such as the loss of parents at a young age. I'm also going to be talking about and showing some graphic images connected to some of the ideas in the title there, Blood and Skin. So do feel free to look away or to exit if you need to at any of these points. I'm just going to check, maybe Christina could just give me a verbal indication. I'm hoping that my slides have moved on there and you can see an image on the screen with two hands interlinked.
Yes, your slides are working. We're great.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll go back to my screen again. I'm going to start with a bit of a personal anecdote. I'm really drawn to this film for a number of reasons. On the one hand, it represents an important pivot point for me between previous research that I've done and current research that I'm engaged in. So one of my topic areas, as Christina mentioned in my bio, previously was the child on screen and the child in Spanish cinema. That was one of my topics that I looked at in my PhD thesis. And I'm now moving into thinking about other questions and other areas, and one of those is particularly driven by content that is female-led behind the scenes. So I'm interested in representations in terms of gender on screen, but I'm also interested in how the behind-the-scenes makeup of the technical teams influence those representations. So obviously this film kind of represents both of those areas and issues, given that it focuses on a child and is directed by a female filmmaker. But I'm also particularly drawn to it for personal reasons, given that it focuses on a 6-year-old girl, and I myself am a parent to 2 young boys. One is 6 and the other is 3. And when I was preparing this talk over the last couple of weeks, something happened with my eldest son that really, for me, crystallized a lot of the ideas that I was thinking about around this film and what I want to talk about today. So my eldest had a wobbly tooth recently. It just came out this week, actually. So he had a visit from the tooth fairy, which he was delighted with. And he was talking about this experience to me one evening. And he said that his gum felt particularly tender. So he told me to touch it so I could feel how tender it was. And this led to a conversation where we talked about the fact that although I could touch his gum and he could feel me touching his gum, I wouldn't be able to feel and experience the tenderness, the pain that he was experiencing. And for me, that moment just summarized a lot of the ideas that are going on in Estiu around notions of touch, around connections, tactile connections between child and mother, and also how the child understands his physical body and physical being in the wider world around him. So for me, this really demonstrates that central concern of Estiu, in which Frida navigates and attempts to understand her relationship between her body and the wider world, which, as we know, is particularly contingent on the death of her parents to age-related illnesses. And I've just included this quote here to set up some of the ideas that I want to think about today from Claudia Castañeda and her book Figurations, Childs, Bodies and Worlds, which I highly recommend for anybody interested in representations of children, not just on screen, but more broadly. And she says, and I'm quoting her here, "The child is figured as a more dynamic body than its adult counterpart. It is a body whose very materiality, both the synapses and the bodily functions, vision, touch, etc., they underlie, is uniquely generated through the interaction between body and world." End quote. So let's talk a little bit about Estiu, and I just want to give a little bit of background about the film and my interest in it before I move into my talk proper. So Estiu, and I'm not going to try and pronounce 1993 in Catalan because I don't speak Catalan, we'll talk about that in a moment, or Summer 1993, is the first feature-length film of Carla Simón, who is on the left in this image you can see on my slide, next to Valérie Delpierre, who is the producer of the film. It's in Catalan, as I said, she's a Catalan filmmaker, and obviously it's 6 years old now, it came out in 2017, so it's still a fairly recent film, but I think it's important to revisit it at this point in particular, given that Simon's second feature film, Algaràs, about a peach farming family in rural Catalonia, who experienced the devastating impact of contemporary corporate capitalism on their way of life, has recently been released. I just watched it the other weekend on Mubi in the UK. I don't know if it's available in Canada yet. Perhaps Christina can advise if she's managed to find it anywhere. It won the Golden Bear Award at the Berlin Film Festival, and it was Spain's entry for the best international, or is, sorry, Spain's entry for the best international film Academy Award. So, you know, the success of her first feature-length film is something that we're seeing continuing in her career in her second feature-length film, which is currently on the circuit. So to return to Estiu then, the film was nominated for 57 awards and won 38, including the Best First Feature Film Award at the Berlin Film Festival and the Best New Director Goya in Spain. It was also, like Algaràs, put forward for the Oscar for the Best International Film, but it wasn't ultimately shortlisted by the committee. The film's really interesting from the point of view of Spanish history, or maybe we could say Catalan history there as well. I mentioned that the film is in Catalan, that Carla Simón is Catalan, which I think is quite interesting in itself, that we're seeing this kind of plaudits for and the celebration of a Catalan language, Catalan film in the context of Spanish cinema. I'm not planning on particularly talking about that in detail today, but it's certainly something that we could discuss in the Q&A if people are interested in that. So in terms of history, the film is clearly, as the title indicates, looking back to that early 90s moment in Spain. And 1993 is a really significant moment for Spain, given that 1992 was celebrated as this moment of Spain's arrival into the European community, wider acceptance into the European community with events such as the Olympic Games in Barcelona. And there are subtle references to that kind of celebratory culture around the year of 1992 in the film. I think at one point Frida wears a t-shirt with the mascot from the Olympic Games on it. So, but we're not in 92, we're in 93. And we're not celebrating. It's a film of disappointment. It's a film of disillusionment generally. It's a film that's looking back and rethinking whether this moment was in fact that celebration that it was deemed to be at the time. But it's also very personal in its history. It's thinking about Carla Simon's own personal history, her own upbringing. It's autobiographical. Like Frida, she lost both her parents to age-related illnesses. This is her childhood, or a retelling of her childhood that we're witnessing on screen. There are several readings out there already about this film, and particularly its place within the wider paradigm of child-centred cinema in Spain. And I'd recommend in particular Stuart Davis, Rachel Beanie and Sarah Thomas's takes on the film. I've got a slide at the end of my PowerPoint with all my references if anyone's interested and wants to follow up any of these after my talk. But these scholars and critics all take the film in terms of its relationship to its antecedents in terms of child-centred cinema. That's not what I'm going to focus on today, and I feel like I've spent my introduction just telling you what I'm not going to do. I will get to what I'm actually going to do in just a moment. But I think it is really interesting to reflect on its positioning, both in terms of that history of Spanish cinema and some of its predecessors, such as El Espíritu de la Colmena, The Spirit of the Beehive by Victor Erice from 1973, Cría Cuervos, Raise Ravens by Carlos Saura from 1976, both of which star Ana Torrent in the lead role. And then also more recently some of the historical memory type films like Guillermo del Toro's El Laberinto del Fauno or El Espinazo del Diablo as well, Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone. So let's move on to what I actually want to talk about today then. I'm going to cover 4 key areas, I hope, if time allows, in my talk. The first of these is to do with the wider context of the film. I've given you a bit of background here, but I want to just talk a little bit more about how I view the film in terms of the wider direction of travel of Spanish cinema in a contemporary context. In that section, I'm going to talk a little bit about post-crisis Spanish cinema, but I'm also going to think back to the transition to democracy and its legacy and how that comes to the forefront in this film. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about AIDS and invisibility, because I think that's also key to understanding what's going on in Estiu. In the second section, I'm going to talk about blood, and I'm going to think about Spanish blood and the sort of history of blood and violence in Spanish culture. I'm also going to think about the wider significances of blood in cinema and TV, very briefly, of course, but I want to at least kind of gloss that as a contextual reference. And then in the last section, I'm going to think about the ways in which Frida comes into contact with blood that are not necessarily about her experience as a child who has lost parents to age-related complications and who is potentially thought to have to potentially be HIV positive as well. So I'm going to think about blood and nature, blood and death, and also menstrual blood, all of which appear in the film in various ways. I'm then going to think about skin and that connection to the body. I'm going to think about scratching, as the title of my talk alludes to. I'm going to think about the skin as a boundary, but also a point of connection. And I'm going to think about its vulnerability. And that's hopefully going to lead me into my final section where I talk about touch and the importance of tactility in the film. I'm going to think about playing tag and grazed knees, which I think are the epitome of childhood perhaps. And I'm going to think about haptic visuality and the way in which touch functions as understanding in this film. And I think one of the things that's really important to talk about just before I launch into this, Christina and I, when we've been talking about this event, Cristina was saying to me that what she is often struck by with Spanish language cinema and culture more broadly is that although it has a specific resonance within the culture that it emerges from, it can also speak to more broad and universal concerns. And I think that summarizes Estiu perfectly, because although it's thinking about 1990 Spain and the legacy of the transition to democracy in terms of that specific context, it's also ultimately a portrait of grief, of loss and mortality, specifically from that child perspective. But it's also even more broadly about a child trying to understand her place in the world. And I think that's something that resonates beyond Spanish language context. So I hope that that everyone listening today can take something from these elements of the film. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly then about the wider context of the film, or at least how I understand the film in relation to other contemporary Spanish films emerging from this particular moment. And one of the things that I think is really important to mention here is that this film comes at a time that might be seen in relation to another post phase. I think I've mentioned post-Franco already at some point today. It's part of the post-crisis Spanish cinema movement, we could say, I think. Although it happens, or it's released 10 years after the economic crash of 2007-8, which is often referred to as La Crisis in Spanish, I think there are several ways in which we can position this film as part of a wider paradigm of cinematic works that deal with a particular set of themes connected to the economic crisis and also have a particular aesthetic approach. And one of the things that we see in this emerging cinema is an emphasis on precarity, which is connected, of course, to the economic precarity that many people faced and still continue to face in the wake of that economic crash. And also a kind of correlation of that precarity with physical vulnerability. This is something that Dean Alberton talks about in his article, which I've popped the title on this slide here, Prime Risks, the Politics of Pain and Suffering in Spanish Crisis Cinema. One of the films that Alberton talks about is La Chispa de la Vida, which is pictured in the still here. And he sees this kind of connection between precarity and physical vulnerability coming to the fore in these films that emerge in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. This is something that we also see in Belén Vidal's article, A Somatic Poetics of Crisis Cinema, The Gesture of Self-Harm in 3 Spanish films, where she focuses in particular on wounded bodies, on wounds, on blood. And this is particularly relevant, I think, to Estiu, given that emphasis on blood, which we'll move on to think about just shortly. One of the films that Vidal talks about is Stockholm. There's a still from that on the slide here, where the female character, the female protagonist, who doesn't have a name, she's just referred to as her, wipes her own blood onto the door frame in an apartment in which she is staying. And I think what's really interesting is Vidal talks a lot about self-harm, and she talks about the female body and its significance in this context. She talks about open wounds and a particular aesthetic around those. But she also devises a common aesthetic approach in these films, which include walking shots, handheld camera work, tight and medium close-ups that restrict our access or knowledge. I think you can see an example of that in this still on the PowerPoint here. A focus within the mise-en-scène on bodily symptoms, especially blood. Again, that's pictured in this still. And I would argue that we see all of these aesthetic components in Estiu, which is why I'm reading it within this framework of post-crisis Spanish cinema. But it's also, or rather, it's not specifically referencing the economic crisis, right? It's looking back further in that it's set in 1993 Spain. So it's not set in the aftermath of the economic crisis of 2007-2008. It's set in the early 90s. And even within that, it's almost like a historical mise en abîme, because it's looking back beyond the 90s to the transition to democracy after Franco's death in 1975, and the legacy that that transition left for the younger generations. So it's not focusing specifically on those who were around at the time of the transition, but rather the coming generation. And this is obviously relevant in the context of the film being autobiographical, because, and this is something Davis says in his article, both the fictional Frida and the real Carla Simón are victims of the post-transition generation's hedonism, characterised by widespread drug abuse, with Spain particularly affected by the AIDS epidemic amongst European countries. And that's a quote there from Davis on the screen. And this image is Carla Simón herself as a child. And I imagine that you can see the correlation between this image and the image on the poster that Christina put together for the event, which features Laia Artigas in very exaggerated makeup in a similar fashion to Carla Simón in her real childhood here. So coming back to this idea of the transition and its legacy and the significance of AIDS in the Spanish context, I think it's interesting to reflect on how this film makes visible a narrative around AIDS and the experience of AIDS, not by those who were direct sufferers of the virus, but rather the future generation, or those impacted by that particular generation. And this is something I think that we're interested in as a culture more broadly, not just in the Spanish context. I'm thinking of, for example, the UK series It's a Sin, which was out last year or the year before, which is about making visible that particular moment and that crisis to younger generations. One of my French colleagues also alerted me to the film 120 BPM, which is also about AIDS narratives. It's about the ACT UP movement in France in the 1980s. So it seems to me that this is something that we are starting to diversify in terms of the types of narratives that we're seeing around AIDS, that perhaps go beyond the kind of stereotypical notion of victimhood that tends to dominate some of the more mainstream or traditional narratives around this. It's not my area of expertise at all, but there are several publications out there which I'm planning to follow up after this talk. And if anybody's got any thoughts, I'd be interested to talk about that some more. So coming back to Spain, Paul Julian Smith noted in 1996, actually, that AIDS in Spain is more stubbornly invisible than most. And he talks about how, in his book Vision Machines, how AIDS raises questions that problematize the visual field and forms of representation in general. The invisible virus, whose relation to visible marks on the body is irreducibly complex. And I think that Estiu does something really interesting in terms of that dynamic of visibility and invisibility at the crux of AIDS, HIV virus, potential sufferers of the virus as well. And I'm going to talk a bit about that as we move through the presentation. In the background of this slide, you can see a scene from the film where Frida is in the doctors being subjected to various tests to check her status. We presume, it's not explicitly said, but we garner that that's what's happening here. And the intimation is that this is not the first time. There are several conversations that go on either with Frida or around Frida that talk about her having to undergo several tests in various different scenarios. And even when it seems like they've said she's not HIV positive, there still seems to be a question or a doubt over it that's kind of hanging around throughout the film. So this leads me nicely into thinking more specifically about blood and its significance in the film. And I want to just pause to think about the significance of blood more broadly, perhaps beyond this film at this point, in a Spanish context, but also beyond that. And coincidentally, Marcia Kinder's book, Blood Cinema, The Reconstruction of National Identity in Spain, was released in 1993. And in it, she talks about how the title, in particular, Blood Cinema, might evoke Lorca's Blood Wedding and Saura's cinematic adaptation of that work, as well as Goya's oeuvre, for example, Saturn Devouring His Son, The Duel with Cudgels, and The 3rd of May. So she very much intimates this heritage of blood and violence that's at the core of Spanish culture in the opening lines. I think that's the first line, actually, of her book. She then goes on to talk about how it can evoke as well a national cinema that's excessive in its graphic depiction of violence and obsessive in its treatment of incestuous relations. And she extends that further to talk about the recent national history that glamorized death, for example, Francoism and the Civil War. And finally, she dates that back even further to kind of look at these roots of blood and violence in Spanish culture, talking about Black legends of cruelty and violence, dating back to the Inquisition and the Conquest. And I think this really shows that kind of heritage of blood and violence, that trajectory that we can trace through different forms of Spanish culture. But of course, blood is not unique to Spain, and an interest in blood and violence is not unique to Spanish culture either. And I want to pause here as well to think about more generally ways in which we have seen blood become a preoccupation of contemporary visual cultures. And one of those is some of the works that I was just talking about in terms of AIDS narratives, and thinking about the way in which we're revisioning those in contemporary culture. But we could also say, for example, that we've got a renaissance in terms of vampires in culture. Forgive the typo on the slide there, that should read Blood, Vampires and AIDS. And for example, you could think about Javier Aldanare's article here, where he talks about AIDS and vampires and blood in the series True Blood. Another way in which we've seen an interest in blood is in horror film, and particularly horror film by female filmmakers of late. This is something that Patricia Pisters talks about in her book New Blood in Contemporary Cinema, Women Directors and the Poetics of Horror. One of the films that she looks at in that book is the French film Raw. So this is not something that's unique to Spanish culture, this emphasis on blood and its potential for contagion or infection. This is something that we see in cinema and television and literature too as well. Okay, so I'm going to move on then to think about the ways in which Frida encounters blood in Estiu. And these are not solely linked to her experience as potentially HIV positive. It's not uniquely connected to the potential threat of AIDS. That is there, but I want to first of all look at some of the ways in which she encounters blood in other contexts and how she attempts to understand that. So sorry if there's any vegetarians in the room, feel free to look away. This scene is, I think, one of my favourites from the film because it really emphasises how the film centralizes a child within the cinematography and the aesthetics. And one of the ways in which Frida comes into contact with blood in the film is through nature. And this is because she's moved from urban Barcelona to the rural Catalan countryside. And as Stuart Davis talks about, she comes into close contact with organic cycles of life and death because of that. The scene in the butchers, and this is the establishing shot of that scene, a close-up, an extreme close-up on a chicken being dissected on a chopping board in the butchers. Frida and Anna, her cousin, looking on, fascinated. This comes immediately after a scene in which Frida has been surrounded by live chickens collecting their eggs. So it very much emphasises that organic quality of life and death in the film. One of the other ways in which blood and death are associated in the film comes in the penultimate scene when Frida, for the first time, asks Marga questions about what happened to her mum. She asks, how did my previous mum die? And she asks, did she bleed a lot? Emphasising that association with blood and death, which is central to the film, or is part of the film's emphasis on blood. But Marga quickly dispels this idea, saying most people who die don't bleed. It's only if you have an accident and you get a wound. So there's that kind of disassociation that Marga makes between blood and death. And indeed, this is emphasised in another scene in which Frida encounters blood, not in the context of death, but in terms of its potential life-giving properties. This, I don't know if you can see it too well, it's quite dark on the screen, but it is quite a dark scene in the film itself. Marga's suffering, she's on her period and she's suffering from cramps, not feeling great. So she's lying in bed and she's sort of half asleep, and Frida rather tenderly goes in and tries to comfort her and asks, is she sick? And of course, in the back of our minds as viewers, we're perhaps thinking that she has seen her mother become sick and ill, and we do sense that there's worry and preoccupation there from the child in this moment. And Marga quickly explains, I've got my period, I'm not sick, but I've got my period and it hurts. And shortly after that, she goes to the bathroom and changes her bloody sanitary towel while she is there with Frida in the bathroom. And I think this brief scene is really important in terms of understanding the significance of blood and what that means in the context of the film. It demonstrates Marga's openness with Frida about this particular aspect of a woman's life that's often hidden away or shielded from children. And I think this really contrasts with the way in which other conversations, particularly those connected to the deaths of her parents, happen around Frida and without including her in them. So for me, this really brief scene is important in terms of establishing that connection between Frida and Marga, which we see develop over the course of the film. And that brings me into thinking about skin and its potential for connecting and as a point of connection in the film. One of the ways in which we see skin manifest in Estiu is in Frida's experience of eczema and scratching at the skin, as we can see in this still here. This scene comes quite early on in the film, and we can see that Frida is somewhat anxious and still just a bit unsettled by everything that's been going on. She's kind of scratching at her skin, and hopefully you'll remember this scene where Marga turns and asks her, tells her not to scratch and asks her, what's wrong? I can only help you if you talk to me. And Frida says, oh, my hair's not sitting right. Marga tries to sort it, and there's this moment of tactility as she tries to kind of fix Frida's hair, but Frida's very resistant, and Marga ends up saying, well, you do it yourself then, and rather petulantly, as most 6-year-olds have their moments like this, she throws the comb out of the window. And I think this is really interesting in terms of thinking about skin and touch and tactility. First of all, it's probably worth mentioning that the eczema is not a moment of anxiety, or it's not a manifestation of the trauma that she's experiencing. It turns out to be an allergy to the family cat. So, it turns out to be fairly innocent and coincidental, but we can't help but read it, I think, initially at least, as a symptom of the wider trauma that Frida is suffering from. And I think that's where I was kind of going with this title of the talk today, Scratching at Old Wounds, because I felt like there's something in that gesture, that sort of physical manifestation of stress, that I think we can probably all relate to, or at least we perhaps know of people who have physical reactions to very stressful situations. And at the same time, I wanted to evoke that rhetoric that we often hear from right-wing factions in the Spanish context when it comes to dealing with the past. They don't want to open old wounds. And for me, I think this film is really, it is scratching at that old wound, which is really interesting, because I think it's both a personal and a political gesture that's happening. I don't think I've fully worked out exactly what I think about that, so I would be interested to hear if anybody has any thoughts on that particular angle. Anyway, returning to this moment of intimacy and tactility, physical contact between Marga and Frida that Frida ultimately rejects. This for me is crucial in the film in terms of understanding Frida's desire for reciprocity, of tactile understanding of her place within the wider world. And I was thinking about Sarah Ahmed and Jackie Stacey's comment about the skin as both a boundary object and as the site of exposure or connectedness. It's a point where Frida is drawing her boundaries, is defending or defining herself, but at the same time desiring that contact with someone else and not always finding it. And I think Ahmed and Stacey's comment really demonstrates the vulnerability of the skin in that sense and its wider metaphorical significance in this film. So if we think about vulnerable skin in Estiu, we see that the skin is liable to penetration in medical settings, as we've already seen at the bottom of the slide, by needles extracting blood, but also in more natural and organic circumstances. And the image at the top there is Frida when she's cut her knee after playing, and I'm going to talk about that scene in the next section on touch. But I wanted to just pause and think about this quote here from Stephen Connor in this context. In his book, The Book of Skin, he talks about how the skin is vulnerable to cutting, tearing and abrasion, which makes the care for the entirety of the skin fundamental in human beings. And I really like this bit. The skin connects and connects with everything. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about the importance of connection and tactility in this film. So moving on to think about touch then, and this is my final section of the presentation today. So I mentioned the scene in which Frida cuts her knee, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail here. So Frida is in the village, she's meeting some of the local children, and they're playing a game of tag, which I think is interesting in that touch is central to it, right? Because you are trying to touch the others if you're it, or you're trying to avoid being touched if you are not. In this version, it seems like the children have safe spaces or bases where they're not allowed to be touched. So Irene is pictured on top of this green tube or tunnel here, and it seems like when they're on these structures, they cannot be tagged, as it were. Frida's desperately trying to interact with these children and make friends, and she does this by saying, do you know what happened to my mum? And Irene kind of says, yeah, I do. And then she says, you know, my dad died too. And that sort of allows Irene to feel like she can let Frida play. But she becomes it. She becomes the other. She becomes the tagger. She runs around and she falls and cuts her knee. And Irene goes over to see if she's okay. And at this point, her mother, this is Marga's friend, panicked, runs over, urging her not to touch Frida, which obviously speaks to that fear of contamination and potential contagion that we've been talking about in terms of Frida and her potential HIV positive status. Mila Zoll talks about how the fear of contracting HIV rests on a conception of touch as a lethal and abject transgression of corporeal boundaries. And we see that panic, we see that fear in this particular scene. But interestingly, this helps solidify Marga's connection to Frida. She is angry at her friend's reaction, and she rather protectively picks Frida up in her arms and carries her away from the playground at this point. Now, in the immediately following scene, we see Marga cleaning Frida's knee up. And I think what's really interesting about this scene is that we have this rather natural or naturalistic moment of Frida investigating the cut, playing with the blood, and she's instructed by Marga not to play with the blood, not because of a potential HIV positive situation, but just because that's what you would say as a mum to your children in that context. Frida continues investigating the blood as Marga cleans up her knee, and she puts a wee plaster on and she says, you know, done, cured, I've fixed you. And it's a real moment of tenderness and care and loving touch between them that really contrasts with that panic and hysteria of her friend in the previous scene. But what I really love about this scene is the following moment, where Marga instructs Frida to wash her hands, and their hands intermingle in the sink with the water, as you can see in the still on the screen. You can't quite see it here. I was trying to get a good screen grab, but it's quite difficult because it all happens quite quickly, and the camera also remains with Frida, as it does throughout most of the film, actually. But Marga grabs a towel, just visible in the left of the frame here, and then she dries Frida's hands in the towel. And this moment of tactile connection between them is really striking as a moment in which they are bonding. That tactility is not rejected by Frida, which I think is really interesting. And as a mum, I know I do this frequently, probably every day, that sort of mutual hand washing and hand drying. I'll also just say that I only noticed after having written the abstract, when I was reviewing the film and writing this talk, or planning the talk, I realized that water is a really important fluid within the film as well. And I'm interested to think that through. I didn't have a chance to do it for today, but if anyone has any thoughts on water as well, I'm thinking perhaps there's a cleansing, purifying significance there. One of my colleagues and collaborators had mentioned potentially the idea of baptism, this sort of rebaptism, joining a new family, and religion is quite important in the film. So yeah, any thoughts on that in the Q&A would be interesting as well. Okay, so I'm going to park the water idea and think then about haptic visuality. And for anybody who's not familiar with the concept, I'm basing my take on it today from Laura Marks's book, The Skin of the Film. In it, she talks about the title of her book as a metaphor, and the concept more generally, to emphasize the way film signifies through its materiality, and also suggests the way that vision itself can be tactile, as though one were touching a film with one's eyes. Now, I'm not the first person to read a haptic visuality in this film. Silvia Guillamón Carrasco, in a really excellent article that looks at this film alongside other works by female filmmakers such as Isabel Cochet, Paula Ortiz and Margol, talks about how there's a kind of haptic visuality which allows for greater closeness to the girl's subjectivity in the film. And she mentions, for example, handheld camera work, grainy images, close-ups of characters, and scenes of physical contact, which help create the world of affections in which Frida lives. And I think this scene in the still is one such example, where she's eating 2 ice lollies at once, and Marga is sort of cleaning her messy face. It's that kind of very sort of naturalistic moments between child and mother, like the hand washing that I just talked about as well. I'm aware that I'm approaching the 40-minute mark, and I don't want to talk for too long, so I am just going to wrap up in the next few minutes. I've got some quotes here from Marx, and obviously I don't have time to go into them in detail, but I wanted to include some ideas of what this haptic visuality might look like, because I know that when I was first approaching it as a student, I found it quite difficult to understand what was meant by it. And I think sometimes if you have a quote and an image, it can help make that more accessible. So Marx talks about this difference between optical visuality and haptic looking. Haptic looking, she says, moves over the surface of an object, is focused on texture rather than form, moves rather than focuses, and grazes rather than gazes. And I think this sums up, if we think about the way in which Frida interacts with her new environment, I think this haptic visuality is evident. In the still on the screen here, you can see Frida walking down an external staircase in her new home. This is the first morning, that she's there, and she kind of grazes her hand down the wall as she walks, and you can see her really looking at that textured wall as well, which I think fits well with that idea of haptic visuality. Now, Guillamón Carrasco talked about it being important for her subjectivity, and I think that is an element of it. But I would also like to propose that there's a more personal significance here for Carla Simón as the filmmaker, and given that the film is an autobiographical piece. Marx talks about how haptic visuality is often about awakening memories of touch through cinema, and particularly memories that are not available to vision. And I'm wondering here if there's something about these kind of moments of touching, these moments of water, these moments with water and the tactility of that, if there's something about accessing memory here that might be significant for Simón, for the filmmaker. And I'm going to conclude just by thinking about this final scene, which shows, and it's hard to tell from the image because it's a bit of a melee, but it shows Estiu, Frida's new dad, her uncle, Anna, her cousin, and Frida, of course, having a bit of fun, play fighting and tickling on the bed prior to them going to bed. They're in their night dresses that they got from their grandma earlier in the film. And Stephen Connor, in his book, The Book of Skin, which I mentioned earlier, talks about how we might take some pleasure in that sort of helplessness in those moments of being tickled, for example, in terms of, and I'm quoting him here, the sensation of shapedness, boundedness and entirety that it may give to a person with an insecure sense of their own body image and boundaries. He says, we depend upon the world to give us shape, which we present to it in order to feel it. And I feel like this moment represents something of a culmination for Frida, given that in the next moment, there's a release, there's an emotional release. It's a really moving scene when she starts crying, but she's unable to articulate what it is that's wrong. But it feels like there's this moment of security, of safeness, of reciprocal touching and tactility that allows her to at least start the grieving process in this final moving image. And actually the sound of her crying continues as the screen fades to black and the credits start. It's really, really moving. And I think it comes full circle in that we start the film with her playing a game the night that her mother has died or been buried, perhaps, we don't quite know. And a rather mean boy says to her, why aren't you crying? So we come away from these scenes of fluid water tactility to a scene of more concrete touch that doesn't involve water, perhaps signifying that these relations are no longer fluid and that they are more secure. But we have an emotional release through tears. And I'm not going to give much of a conclusion. I'm just going to stop there. And I hope that that's been enjoyable. And I'm really looking forward to hearing any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That was amazing. I was quickly jotting down notes as you were speaking. If you'd like to minimize your PowerPoint, and then we can get a broader screen of our chat. Wonderful. I would like to invite everyone who's listening to our live stream to go ahead and type in your questions into the chat box in the live stream, and I will be more than happy to read them out, or Sada will read them out to our presenter. So please don't be shy. Go ahead, and any questions you may have, just type them in and we will make sure we ask those for you. Just because there's a bit of a lag between our live stream and the audience, I thought maybe I'll start us off with a question. And it has to do with Frida, and it kind of brings in your question about water.
Okay.
So, first of all, the actor is incredible. Beyond, I found that she communicated beyond verbal communication. Like the expressions on her face, her eyes. And I think the director really does a wonderful job of bringing that camera angle to really focus in on her face, but still maintaining the mise en scène as part of the scene and part of us reading her. I found her at first, oh, it's your typical young girl. She's had this tragedy. But then my own research interests kind of creep in. I found her very troubling. There's a very dark side to her, especially when we dig into more of those individual moments with Anna.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe if you could speak a bit more to that, because the seminal scene of the threat she poses to Anna is in the river.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll leave my question at that and let you go for it.
Yeah, that's such an interesting intervention. And so I took quite a lot of inspiration from a roundtable discussion about this film that was part of a film festival called Screening the Child, organised by Rachel Beanie, who I cited at the beginning of my talk. I can share that YouTube link, Christina, with you because it's on YouTube to watch. Some of your students might be interested to follow it up. I was at that round table, but I also rewatched it in preparation for this because I had remembered finding it really stimulating in terms of ideas. And that was mentioned as part of the round table, that there's something about her, about Frida, that is, that carries with it an element of the monstrous child or the potentially monstrous child, right? And I think that's really fascinating to explore and develop, because I think you're right. You have that same sense of trepidation. I think when you watch it a second time, not so much. I think when you're watching it the first time and you don't know what's going to happen, there's definitely more of a sinister edge, I think, especially like you quite rightly pointed out in terms of her interactions with her younger cousin, which, you know, if you remember that scene that you were talking about with the river, Esteve actually says, "Do you want to kill her? You're going to kill her," which, you know, is really, it's really difficult, right? Because on the one hand, we're sort of really feeling for this child who has lost her parents, who has, you know, been thrust into a new family dynamic where there's another child as well. I mean, it's really, really challenging, I think, as a viewer, because you're sort of torn between that empathy, but also, as you quite rightly pointed out, the trepidation that she potentially has this sinister edge. I mean, she makes me think a lot of Ana Torrent in Cría Cuervos, you know, where in Raised Ravens, where she's got the powder of the tub of bicarbonate of soda from her mother that she thinks is potentially poison, you know, and she actively tries to kill her father, and she thinks she has done it. If anyone's not familiar, it's an amazing film. And I think there's definitely echoes to that film. Even the scene at the beginning where she's got the doll and she's got the blue cardigan on and she's sort of, you know, being told where to go or what to do the first night in that new family setup. That to me was just Ana Torrent and Cría Cuervos, because there's so many scenes of her with the doll. So yeah, I think I could probably keep talking about this, but I'll kind of stop. But I do think you're right that there is that kind of element of the monstrous child. And I would argue we could connect that to the AIDS HIV narrative in terms of sort of that fear or that hysteria around the potentially HIV positive child or individual. I don't think it needs to be a child. That kind of monstrousness that we would associate perhaps, or that was associated with victims of AIDS and HIV. So yeah, I don't know what else to say about that other than I think you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you. And I think it's something that needs to be looked at in more detail, because as far as I'm aware, in any reading that I've done on the film, I don't think that's been treated in depth yet. But I think it's fascinating. So yeah, we should talk more about that.
I think I definitely do want to talk more about that, because I found it troubling also. Very troubling that here we have this child who's lost everything in her world and trying to find her spot, her space in this world. And she's in this pre-adolescent initial pubertal stage, that not only is she trying to figure out her body and its changes, and I love that one slide you had of the screen grab of her on the lounge chair with the cowboy boots, pretending to be the mother figure. But that underlying, well, it's not so much that she may or may not be HIV positive, that's the threat here. There's a more imminent threat in her treatment of Anna.
Yeah.
Which I found just more disturbing and rather interesting at the same time, if I'm going to say it that way. But I really liked the other component, that some things are explicit, other things are more implicit, and that we don't get a firm statement of her HIV status. We're left to figuring out the puzzle as we go along. So that is part of the mystery, I think, as an audience member, trying to figure out really what is the dynamic at play here. So I do have a comment from the audience. It's not a question, more of a comment. That's how it starts, from Jamie. And I'll just read it off the screen here. Not a question, but a thank you, as you provided a lot more context to the movie, and I feel I understand more of what the director was trying to convey to the audience.
Great. That's excellent. It's hard sometimes to know, isn't it, how much context to give or what to talk about. And I think you were talking about the scene with her pretending to be the mother, and I absolutely loved that scene, and there's so much I could say about that scene alone. And I think it's a real challenge knowing, right, what do I focus on and what do I not, what do I leave out. So it's great to hear that it was helpful to know a bit more about the context. And the reason that I wanted to talk about the post-crisis cinema stuff is because I think it's easy to read this film within that paradigm of child-centered cinema, or like in terms of your work as well, Christina, thinking about girlhood and representations on screen of girlhood. I think that's a perfectly valid way to approach this film. And to be honest, I did doubt myself in the middle of the week. I thought, oh, maybe I should have talked more about this, because I could have talked more about Ana Torrent and about Del Toro and about the child on screen and this, but I chose to kind of go a different way with it. And I think that just speaks to why you wanted to do this series in the first place, right? That actually these films are so rich and allow so many different ways of engaging and thinking about them. So yeah, it's really good to hear that the context was helpful and made sense and illuminated different ways in which the film can be read.
Most definitely. And thank you, Jamie, for the comment. Do we have a question maybe from Sara? Did you have a question?
I do, yes. Thank you so much for the presentation. This was amazing. And I just finished watching the film this morning, so I still have so many thoughts going on in my head. But I was going to ask you about water, and then you brought it up, how you're also thinking about it. And I loved how you're talking about tactile connection, but there's also other, I guess, points of contact, right? Between skin and water, or skin and like plants. That scene where Frida is inside the car trying to reach out to see if she can touch. So I'm thinking about these kind of like human, non-human touch. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Thinking about bodies of water, you've talked about the river, but there's also several scenes in the bathtub, or like washing their hands. So, I don't know, I think there's something there. I don't know if there's potentially a connection between like water and memory, or water and something else. And this sort of connects with space too, which is a question that I had. We have Barcelona, which it appears at the beginning of the film, but then it's just referenced, but we don't see that space anymore. And then on the other hand, we have like the countryside, but it's mostly inside the house, or there's a couple of scenes in the forest. So like space has an importance in the film, definitely. And then just like a minor comment, there were also some references to eating flies. So Frida was always saying like, oh, do you know how many flies you can eat while you're sleeping? So that could potentially be another point of contact to think about in the film.
Oh, yeah, I've just scribbled down everything you said there. And yeah, I think that's fascinating. And the water idea, obviously, as I said, in the abstract, I don't mention water because I'd watched the film again. I'd seen it for the first time, I think 2 years ago, in preparation for that roundtable I was talking about before. And then, so I had rewatched it after Christina and I had decided this would be the film that I would talk about. And obviously I had taken notes and I had thought, and I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then rewatching it again to prepare the talk, I just suddenly was struck by the prevalence of water and how prominent it is. And yeah, I really, I'm going to talk about water first and I'll come back to some of the other things that you said. But yes, you're right. In terms of, you know, the river, so a kind of natural water space, but also the bathtub. The bathtub's really important. I did have, I think, one image from where they're in the bath as one of my kind of backgrounds in the talk, but obviously didn't talk about that in particular. That kind of connects with Christina's point, actually, about that sort of potentially troubling aspect of the way in which Frida and Anna interact, or the way in which Frida interacts with Anna, because that there's one scene where Anna's lifted out the bath. So they're in the bath together. Anna's lifted out the bath and Esteve is kind of rather, you know, tactilely dealing with her post-bath, you know, drying her hair. And he sort of turns the hair down himself and makes her laugh. And then it sort of cuts back to Frida and she's kind of slumped in the corner of the bath, just observing what's going on. And, you know, I think there's, again, that sort of dual aspect to that, where we sort of feel for her, we empathize, we think she feels like she's on the outside here and she's not part of this. But at the same time, we can see that she also is struggling with that. You know, and finds that difficult and feels resentment in a way towards Anna, I think. So yeah, I think bath scenes are important. The washing of the hands, like I talked about. There's several moments with Lola, so one of the other aunties who visits periodically from Barcelona, that involve water as well. So there's one scene where they're talking on the bed and she's kind of lying with her hand on Frida. I did have this slide in, but removed it because I had too much material. And they're talking about Atlantis, and they're talking about this sort of developing of gills and going to live in their homes. And, you know, what do you think about that? And she says, oh, well, I can swim underwater as well. So I wondered if there's something there about this desire to return to the family home and the original family setup. And we see that in other ways as well, right? She frequently asks, what's happened to my old house, you know, and they sort of say, oh, you know, it's empty, it's going to be rented. She tries to phone her mother and obviously the phone rings and it's not picked up. So I think there's almost this, perhaps this idea that there's a connection between water and returning to that former family dynamic. I mean, I don't know if I want to go into psychoanalysis, but I'm almost thinking about that kind of mother-child connection and the sort of intrauterine, you know, being together, but the child also being in water. I was talking about this with my collaborator, Abby Loxham from Liverpool, and she sort of said, there is also just the fact that it's Spain and it's hot and water is needed to cool down. And I was like, yeah, you're right. You know, there is also that kind of, it's just part of an everyday summer, right? I'm just remembering as well, there's the scene where the children play with a hose as well, where Marga says, you know, go and get a cabbage, and they're in their pants playing outside with a hose to cool down. So I definitely think, yes, on the one hand, there is that kind of, well, it's just a part of a Spanish summer. I think Abby's absolutely right. But then there is something on the other side that says to me, I think we can read this symbolically. And And I was kind of thinking about kind of fluid connections or connections being in flux in terms of Frida's personal life. And I think it's interesting that, like I said at the end of the talk there, that final scene of tactility and touch between her and Esteve and Marga and Anna, they're all together at that point. It does feel like there's something solidifying in terms of that family dynamic that perhaps wasn't the case before. So yeah, basically at the moment, I don't have a concrete or coherent answer to your question, other than I think water is really important, and it's something that I'm going to continue thinking about because I think I'm going to develop this into a paper. I hope to anyway, because I think there's definitely something to be said. And I really enjoyed your comments about human or non-human, plants, and yeah, how that might connect in with space as well, and that kind of move from urban to rural as well. Yeah, thank you. That was just a ramble, and I'm sorry for that, but yeah, definitely lots of interesting points, and thank you so much for sharing those ideas.
Wonderful. Sara, did you have a follow-up question, or should I go ahead?
No, you can go ahead. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing so many of your thoughts. This is great.
Thank you.
We don't have a question from the audience, but again, feel free, everybody, don't be shy to drop a question in. We don't want to monopolize the question period between the three of us. But here I go again with my question. Going back to the skin as boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were speaking, I was like, and thinking about Frida, thinking about, she's going through puberty, yet she's a child, but not entirely she's in that in-between space of a lot of changes in her family unit, where she's living, how she's living, where she's living, how does she fit in, how she doesn't fit in. And the skin as her boundary, in not just in the physiological changes she's experiencing as a young girl,
mm-hmm.
but thinking about the scratching, the eczema of the wound that continues to follow her to the rural setting, to the La Casa del Campo, basically.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder of something, this constant reminder that she carries. And thinking about the skin, when you talked about tactile exchanges with other people, like what Sara said, human and non-human. So in line with her HIV positivity or not, because I still don't get a clear Dylan, other than her constantly having those blood work where her skin's being punctured.
Yeah.
Right. And it really brought me to think, okay, how does her skin, it works as a boundary of who she lets in.
Yeah.
But it's also a boundary to keep the contagion in.
Yeah.
So it links up with that whole blood as contagion, blood as a threat, right? A threat to life. And we see a lot of her skin. We know that Spanish culture is more open to certain types of nudity. But I was wondering if you had any further ideas on this. And it's kind of interrelated with the concept of physical vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
It makes her vulnerable, but it also makes others vulnerable if that boundary is broken.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I've just written down loads as well from your question. Yeah, I think I agree with everything that you've said. And I think that Yeah, I hadn't thought about the nudity actually, which is quite interesting, which I think, you know, in some respects could also be described in terms of what we've just said about water, right? That, well, it's hot because it's summer in Spain. So, you know, it makes sense that the children are running around without much clothes on because it's really hot. So yeah, in that respect, you know, there's a kind of, what would the word be? There's a sense of normalcy, right, about that degree of child nudity. I know that Carla Simón talked in an interview, I think, that I read, or it was mentioned in an article that I read about the film, about how careful they were when they were working with the actors, right, the child actors, because obviously when you're working with children who are, I think, in every single scene of the film Frida's in, I think, or almost all of them, if it's not all, you know, there are very strict ways in which you can interact with children in this way. And what I think is really striking, this is kind of a tangent to what you were saying, but I was just thinking about that kind of, yeah, the way in which the children are engaged with by the adult actors is really interesting as well, right? Because it's very naturalistic in some ways in terms of adult-child interactions, but also we have in the back of our mind, right, these are actors though, right? This is not, although this is based on real life, it's not a documentary, this is not what we're watching. And yeah, I was thinking there of the scene where in the river, which we've talked about a few times already, but you know, we don't see Anna when she falls into the water, right? Do you remember that? That Frida, the camera focuses on Frida, which I think aesthetically can be justified by the fact that we are meant to be focalizing these events through Frida. We're meant to be aligned with her. But at the same time, I think there's also a practical dimension to that as well, right? That they presumably didn't dunk the child under the water, because obviously that's potentially very problematic from the point of view of boundaries between, you know, acting, performing, or being that we often get. And yeah, I think that's sort of an aside compared to what you were mentioning. But in terms of, yeah, this sort of constellation of ideas, we could say, in terms of blood, skin, and touch. For me, you articulated really well what I was hoping would come across in the talk, that these three motifs are intricately interlinked in the film. You know, and you're absolutely right that the skin, it works as a boundary both ways, right? It's as you precisely said, it's about what she allows, or who she allows to come into contact with her, but is crucially about keeping something in as well. It's about a boundary or a border that prevents that potential contagion as well. I think it's interesting, you were sort of saying, well, you know, do we know if she's HIV positive or not? I think the implication is that she is not, right? But it's not, you're right, that it's not explicitly said. At one point, there's a conversation about, well, I thought I didn't need to get any more tests, or the doctors in Barcelona said I was fine. But even when she if I remember rightly, but even when she gets those tests that we see, you know, in the film, and which I showed on a couple of the slides, the doctor has the conversation with Marga afterwards that indicates that she might need further tests yet. And Marga sort of says, but they said she's fine, that, you know, she's so, but there's still this doubt, right? And I think that speaks to just a lack of knowledge and an ignorance at the time, which obviously the film's from 2017 and we're in 2023, and we're looking back on this period with a lot more knowledge than they would have had at the time of the events. And I think it really speaks to that kind of ignorance, or that kind of hushed upness of conversations around AIDS in particular. You know, and I think that butcher scene where we see the chicken being dissected in close up is key in that respect, because that scene really focuses, in terms of the mise en scène, on Anna and Frida, but the conversation is happening around us and around them. you know, what happened? Oh, I didn't know you could die of pneumonia nowadays. So there's obviously rumours circulating about what the potential cause of death was. And I think it speaks to shame and guilt around, you know, the origins of these illnesses or complications that the parents experience. And there's the scene in the farmhouse where all the family come to visit, and they're talking about the whole situation, and the grandmother says to Esteve, you could have ended up the same way. So there's this indication that actually perhaps Marga, and I mean, this is me surmising, it's not explicitly said, this idea that Marga and Esteve have retreated from the urban context to the rural, where there's not the same temptations or drug cultures that might tempt people into making decisions that potentially could endanger them and those around them. But you're right, all of this is inferred, it's not explicitly stated. And I think, yeah, I don't know if I've got anything more coherent or complete to say about your point, other than the fact that I completely agree. And I think it does speak to that kind of wider ignorance at the time, or not, and perhaps not ignorance, but just lack of knowledge, because it was still a relatively new phenomenon, virus that they were dealing with. And, you know, it's interesting because that roundtable that I've mentioned a couple of times occurred during the pandemic, right? So watching this film after the COVID pandemic, you know, the coronavirus pandemic, obviously, I think brings it into a new light as well. Like we didn't know, and you know, you're thinking about, you know, however many decades ago the 90s were, more than I like to think of, to be honest, because I'm like, no, the 90s were not that long ago. You know, it's amazing actually how far things have come on, and we still perhaps didn't deal with the pandemic in the best ways, and we've got the benefit of much better networks of knowledge dissemination, more advanced research and whatnot. So I think that's perhaps what it speaks to, that kind of implicit or unspoken side of it. And also I think the sort of shame as well around these kinds of narratives. And that's why I think this film's really important, actually, because it feels like it's trying to make visible an AIDS narrative or AIDS-centered narrative that isn't necessarily complying with the kind of focus on, you know, the stereotypical or conventional AIDS victims. And of course, those stories are valid and we need those as well. But I think this is doing something different in terms of making visible. And perhaps that's where Skin also comes in, because it's kind of connecting those questions of visibility and invisibility, what is seen and what is not seen, what is talked about and what is not talked about. Yeah, sorry, I think that's the most coherent I can be, but it's fascinating and I would love to talk more about it with you.
Yeah, I found that going back to that river scene, when they don't show Anna possibly drowning, but we hear, you know, the sound, we hear her cry.
Yeah.
But to me, what was most poignant in that scene is seeing it through Frida's facial expressions.
Yeah.
Which is, okay, does she regret it or does she not?
Yeah.
So it's a, I have to say, it's a puzzling film on many levels. And adding that on top of that, that it is autobiographical. And then that the fact, just picking up on the theme of contagion, that this contagion is enclosed within a little girl's body, that a little girl is so threatening that with this contagion that she carries. And exactly what you said, in the 90s, obviously, oh my goodness, that's 30 years ago. We did not have the knowledge we have today about the AIDS and HIV contagion, non-contagion, how to treat it, how to prevent it. So, and I think it goes back to the idea of blood, that blood can be death, obviously through the AIDS. But when you talked about Marga, literally showing her blood isn't always dangerous. It can be a life-giving source. And the fact that she's very open about menstruation kind of provides the other side of the discussion around blood, that blood is also something positive. So
yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that menstruation scene is really important for that, because I think it reflects back, like you say, on the other side of that kind of, well, you know, blood is contagion, blood is death, blood is dangerous. Also, well, yeah, you know, through blood we give life, and actually through blood we are alive. So yeah, I definitely think there's that kind of, you know, it's not about one or the other. It's about both. You know, it's both and. But I think it's really, for me, that was really striking, that scene, because you hardly ever see a scene like that on screen, first and foremost. And also the fact that a child witnesses that, to me, that's really striking. And also directly, in terms of, you know, you talked about that parallel between blood and death, blood and life, but also that openness that Marga has with her. And I think there's also an element there, right, that she knows that Frida has seen her mum become unwell. And, you know, I think there's also perhaps that kind of desire to reassure her as well, that this is normal, this is part of life, and this doesn't mean that I'm sick, you know, and this doesn't mean that I'm dying. And there's, you know, an idea of attachment, I think, there as well, that she wants to convey to Frida that, you know, she's not planning on leaving, that she is safe and secure within that environment, even if there are challenges and hurdles to that on both sides, right? Because I think it's just as challenging for Marga. And I really find quite compelling, first of all, Marga generally as a character, but I think, you know, those scenes in which Marga is kind of put in this awkward position between her mother-in-law and her husband, you know, I find that really interesting to see on screen, because, you know, you feel for Marga as well in those moments, right? Like when she says, I want to go in the car, I want to go back to Barcelona with grandma, I don't want to stay here. And Estevi's kind of like, oh, well, maybe, does that typical, can I say that? That's really gender stereotypical, but does that sort of male thing of, oh, yeah, it's fine. And Marga, you can see she's just raging. She's just so mad that, you know, that they're sort of nurturing and building Frida's confidence and trying to make her feel part of the fold. And then Estevi sort of, you know, conforms to what his mum wants to do. And she, you know, she kind of throws something and storms away. And you're like, oh, this is, you know, this is really difficult for her. This is, and it's, you know, it's not her sister's child, you know, it's her husband's sister's child. They're not blood related to come back to blood, you know? And I think there's so much there that speaks to, I've forgotten why we started talking about that, but oh yeah, so yeah, Marga's role and blood and life and death, and yeah, really interesting, I think.
Yeah, and like further on, it's the whole, what is everybody's role in this new family unit? Essentially, everybody needs to figure that out, not just Frida.
Yeah.
But yes, the grandparents are very giving and acquiescing to Frida because of what she's been through. And then the impact that has on what Marga seems to be the main disciplinarian and the main person trying to establish some sort of structure.
Yeah.
And it's a struggle for her to be the only one. But Esteve does recover and does say, no, you're staying here. Let's pull you out of the car. And
through a physical restraint as well, which if we're thinking about touch and we're thinking about that child-parent dynamic, right? Like there are moments when you have to manhandle them, right? Like, you know, I had to do it with my son at nursery this morning. You know, I had forgotten to pick up his baseball cap, and he realized this when we were at nursery. And of course, this was the worst thing in the world. You know, and I had to physically, and he's 3.5, you know, so he's not tiny, but he's also, not huge, but I had to kind of lift him physically into nursery because I'd opened the door and there was other people coming. I'm like, right, come on. So there are these moments when you have to kind of physically move them from one place to the next, even when they're no longer babies and no longer need that. And I think that moment, it's really difficult to watch, right? Because we kind of sympathize. Again, it's that kind of ambivalence. We sympathize with Frida. We understand why she might want to go back to Barcelona, why she might want to go with her grandparents, but we also feel for Marga and Esteve because there's that kind of desire to keep continuity, desire to, I guess, fulfill the wishes of Nels as well, because there's chat at one point about how there was a letter and she had specifically stated that she wanted Frida to be with Marga and Esteve. So, I think I just think it's really remarkable, the film generally, in terms of how obviously there's this tragic backdrop to it, but I think that very naturalistic portrait of child-parent relations, which, as I said at the start, I think personally I can relate very well to, given that I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, the ages of the children in the film. I think a lot of these kind of quotidian moments that we witness between the family members are really they really resonate, I think, with just that sort of everydayness of parenting or being a parent. So, yeah.
Yeah. The normalcy almost of despite the backstory of how they got there, the normalcy of trying to raise 2 young girls.
Absolutely.
Right? So I don't think we have any other questions from our audience members, but I thought maybe if you want to leave us with any last thoughts or comments before we end our session today.
I don't know. I think, what could I say? I guess it's interesting to think about this film, from the various angles and in relation to the various ideas that we talked about. And I think just from that discussion between the three of us there, it's evident that this is a really rich film, right? There's various ways in which you can engage with this, think about it, and relate it to various different angles or themes or ideas. And I think it speaks to a really interesting moment in contemporary Spanish cinema. I was at a conference in Madrid in September last year where I forget who it was, but somebody gave an excellent presentation where they talked about the fact that for the last 5 years at the Goya Awards, the Best New Director Award has gone to a female filmmaker. So it feels like there is a kind of burgeoning of women filmmaker talent emerging in the Spanish context, which I think is really exciting. But I think beyond thinking about the gender of the filmmakers, I think, for me, this film is just really important in terms of what it does with the child on screen, how it reflects back on Spanish history, recent Spanish history. And I would put it as part of a kind of wider paradigm of not just film, but also TV and streaming that is starting to look back at the 90s and suggest that perhaps, it wasn't as great as it was suggested it was. And I think sort of pinpoint some of the contemporary failings, and especially in the context of Spanish democracy, contemporary Spanish democracy, back to this moment, right? And I think, like, for example, this film is up there, Las Niñas by Pilar Palomero, which I haven't seen yet. I've read about, and it's on my list to watch. I've got a dissertation student who's hoping to work on it. So Las Niñas by Pilar Palomero also looks at the 90s and looks at AIDS as well. I think the girl, and you'll like it as well, Christina, because it's adolescence. It's girls and adolescents on screen. I think she's maybe lost a father to an AIDS-related illness. But don't quote me on that because I haven't seen it yet. Veneno, the series by Los Javis, which was on HBO Max in the US. I don't know if it's been screened in Canada. It's not been shown anywhere in the UK, but you can get it through A3 Media Player Premium, which it's fairly cheap on a monthly subscription. You can get a free trial. It's an amazing series and looks back at the 90s and looks back at trans icon Veneno. And it looks at TV and sort of mediations. It's amazing. Cardo as well, which is also by Los Javis, is kind of looking at that sort of 90s moment and yeah, just the disillusion and the kind of broken neoliberal subject. So I definitely posit this as kind of part of that wider paradigm shift of looking at back at the 90s, rethinking it, and perhaps showing ways in which, you know, it wasn't as great as we perhaps first thought, and also reflecting on that connection to the present. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming at in terms of the film. But thank you so much for letting me come along and talk about these ideas and think about these really interesting questions. It's always a joy, I think, to talk about Spanish cinema and Spanish language culture more broadly. So yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity and for this excellent series. I think it's amazing. And I'm sure lots of people will be imitating it in other contexts because it's just brilliant.
Well, I want to extend our thanks to you for participating today, even with the time difference. I know it's quite late where you are. And I have to say my to be read and to be watched list is growing after your presentation. And I'm going to track those films down personally, I would say that. And again, thank you for taking the time to really share your passion about film, about Spanish film, and really about how it can inform a broader sense of humanity, really, when it comes to the AIDS pandemic and how people lived through that experience. So thank you again. It's been wonderful. And I really appreciate that you accepted the invite to our talk today.
Thank you. It's been great.